All right. Well, welcome everybody to the Prescribing Prosperity podcast. My name is Alex Soutsos, and I am the investment advisor here at MedWealth Financial Services. As everybody who is a frequent listener knows, our normal podcast host is Bill Tucker, but unfortunately, Bill is experiencing some technical difficulties today. So I'm going to be stepping in to take over his producer role and co-hosting role. In addition to our normal role here on the podcast. So I'm going to introduce our guest now. Today, we're pleased to be joined by John Carpay. John is the founder and president of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms here in Canada, and we are very fortunate to have someone of his stature joining our show today. So thank you very much, John, for agreeing to come on.
It's an honor to be with you and your listeners today. Thank you very much.
Right, great. So, John, why don't you go ahead and start us off by telling us a little bit about where you began your career and how you got into the legal practice?
Well, I grew up in British Columbia, and as a teenager, developed an interest in politics and justice issues, developed a very strong passion for human rights and for seeing a political system where governments respect our basic freedoms of conscience and religion, expression, association, and so on. So I had this passion for justice and interest in politics. And eventually I went to law school. I didn't start law school till I was 28 years old. And it was more of a pragmatic decision to get myself a means of earning a living because the passion for freedom was already in place. I had the honor of working for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation as their Alberta director for a number of years in Edmonton. And then I put my law degree to work, kind of integrating my passion for freedom with the law degree. And I started the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms in 2010. And so now 15 years later, we've grown into not huge, but not tiny organization. We've got about a dozen full-time staff lawyers across the country, and we've got communication staff, and we sue governments. That's what we do. We are federal, provincial,
that's an expensive business,
but an important one.
We save. The donors get good value for their money because we have staff lawyers. And as you know, and I'm sure many of your listeners know, in-house counsel, even if you're paying somebody $200,000 a year, it's a lot cheaper than getting that same amount of legal work done by an outside firm. It's going to cost you 3 times as much, maybe 4 times as much. So we do hire outside counsel sometimes, but our general rule is that we work with staff lawyers who we have over 80 active cases all over Canada right now, from coast to coast, with our lawyers suing governments in defense of free speech, freedom of religion, conscience, travel, mobility, bodily autonomy. And I anticipate we're going to be heading into equality rights more with this Musqueam agreement that hit the news earlier this month, and the Cowichan court ruling in British Columbia. I would anticipate the Justice Center getting more involved in those Aboriginal issues.
Right. And so is that...
sorry to interrupt, but I was curious to know, what was your trigger for developing this passion for justice and political matters? You said in your teenage years. Was there a particular event? What happened there?
My recollection is there was it was a social studies class, and it talked about the different political philosophies, and it talked about socialism and liberalism and conservatism and the political spectrum and left, right. And I got keenly interested in that, and I recognized that, which I might not have known previously, but that I have strong passion for freedom. I'm a big I'm in strong agreement with, I think it was Jefferson, could have been somebody else, but the government that governs best is the government that governs the least. I think people are better off when we are left to exercise our freedoms and to voluntarily enter into contracts with each other and voluntarily enter into cooperative arrangements. State power is coercive We do need it for some things, like, we got a criminal code. We need a police service to, prosecute people that engage in murder or theft or assault or fraud. So definitely there's a role for government. However, the coercive power of the state is pretty dangerous. It can do a lot of harm. And we're better, people come to their own agreements and understandings without the heavy hand of government managing their daily lives.
Agreed. And it's funny to hear you say that because, one of my friends from my MBA program, I had a discussion with him, and he was a great admirer of the political system in China. He's of Chinese origin, so it stands to reason. And he said to me, but don't you just want the smartest person in charge of everything? And what I said to him was, who's to say who the smartest person is? And is there somebody who is the smartest person in every subject matter? Like, I feel like we're living in the Wizard of Oz having this discussion, because there's no one all powerful Oz that knows everything and is able to divinely intervene in perfect portion and depth into every possible subject matter and industry. And what ends up happening is you get the government exhibiting a heavy-handed approach into areas in which they have little or no expertise, and it creates distortions and those naturally occurring free markets. And so I was really dismayed that somebody of his intellect would even put forth such an idea. But at the same time, I think it speaks to what exists in our society, which is a lot of people just want somebody to think for them and act on their own accord rather than having to do it themselves.
It wasn't that Justin Trudeau who said when he was initially seeking election, he admired the basic Chinese political system?
Yes, it was.
John?
They can turn on a dime. They get things done.
Mm-hmm.
But I loved your response to your Chinese Canadian friend. I mean, who's to decide who the smartest person is? And what if the smartest person does not have a big ego and doesn't step up to the plate, and there's somebody who's not that bright at all, has a big ego, and he or she decides that they are the smartest person and they push their way to the front? I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the discussions about free speech. It's very easy to buy into the concept that the government should protect us from hate, and the government should protect us from misinformation, from disinformation. And I could buy into that, except for this huge practical problem. Who gets to decide what is misinformation, what is disinformation, what is hate? Who gets to make that decision? So in a free country, the freedom of speech means that we are responsible adults and we get to decide for ourselves what is true or false. We don't have a big brother, the heavy coercive hand of government deciding on everybody's behalf what is true and false, and then punishing people for saying what the government deems to be false, right?
Exactly.
This is so even though it's appealing and attractive to say, well, let's ban hate speech, let's ban disinformation. Okay, sounds really attractive, but who gets to decide what is hate and what is disinformation?
Well, exactly. There's no objective classification as to what constitutes hate speech. And as we've seen in our society, in the rapid decline in personal interaction over the last, let's call it 15, 16 years, we have seen a proliferation of people taking offense to absolutely everything. And so there's no, it's a sliding scale. There's no objective, if you say this, that is deemed hateful. At the end of the day, somebody can choose to take offense to anything that you say. It is up to you and your own personal response to what somebody else says in order to dictate what your own response and viewpoint is towards that information or that dialogue that is coming towards you.
I find it interesting how the world has evolved, because when I was a young man, and John, you appear to be a little younger than I am, but you can interject if you agree with this. But when I was a kid, the teachers used to say to us, if someone says something to you that you don't like, just say back to them, sticks and stones can hurt my bones, but words will never hurt me. And that's the way my generation grew up, is don't worry about words. And I've noticed in the last generation, the last 30 years, all of a sudden the words are so critically important, and we've got to be careful not to offend anybody. So when you don't know what's going to offend who, then conversation ends. Then
Oh, no.
public discourse ends, and no one can have an objective, unemotional discussion. Everyone just goes into their corner and sits with their tribe.
And that's just it. It becomes we sanitize language to the point that becomes opaque and impossible to communicate. The entire purpose of language is to communicate information, it's to communicate ideas, but we have gone to such lengths to sanitize the terminology that we use in society today that it becomes ineffective or very difficult to communicate information clearly in an understandable fashion such that the person that you're conversing with understands the message that you're portraying. To give you an example, when somebody introduces another person as their partner, I don't know if they mean their romantic partner. Are they referring to their business partner? I understand the purpose behind it, but in today's society, there's so much acceptance of different types of relationships that I don't think anybody truly cares what type of relationship you're engaging in, and if they do, that's their own problem. And so all it does is it creates confusion because when I'm dealing with somebody, is this somebody who you're in a romantic relationship with, or am I speaking to somebody who is your business companion, and therefore you have a very different dynamic and relationship amongst each other? And so I find that a challenging and frustrating narrative to deal with sometimes.
John, your thoughts on this?
Well, it's a good thing to be polite and to strive for, being polite and being kind. Those are worthwhile goals. At the same time, a country where you have free speech, necessarily as a side effect, people feel offended, and that's normal. I sometimes feel offended. I hear something, radio, television, internet, YouTube, or whatever. I hear something or I read something that I think is just so wrong. It's so false that I feel offended by it. And that's okay that I feel offended, that those are my feelings. But it would be very destructive if I asserted, as many Canadians today are asserting, I feel offended, therefore you're not allowed to say that. It's like the free speech necessarily includes a right to offend. That's not to suggest that you want to be a jerk and just, run around and try to offend as many people as possible, as much as possible. Like, no, of course not. You want to get your point across in the most non-offensive way possible. But at the end of the day, a country where you have free speech is a country where people will feel offended. And sadly, I've heard a lot of people over the years, a lot of Canadians will say, well, I support free speech as long as it's not offensive. And it's like anybody who says that has not thought this through, because if we have a right to not feel offended, then we do not have free speech. Conversely, if we have free speech, individuals do not have a right to not feel offended. So it's one or the other.
John, John, I want to back up a bit. So you started off by saying we sue people, and we sue governments.
We sue governments. We sue governments. We don't sue individuals.
Okay, so you sue governments, but is that all your organization does? What's your objective? What's your raison d'être?
We want to preserve Canada as a free country. And this freedom has been, eroded gradually over the last 40, 50 years, bit by bit by bit. And we're in a very fragile space where if we get something like the Online Harms Act, which is terrible legislation that died with the 2025 election last year, but if that's brought back, combined with other bills before Parliament, like the Strong Surveillance Act, the Cybersecurity Act,
for those not familiar, can you elaborate more on this bill?
I will. But to answer your question, the raison d'être of the Justice Centre is to defend freedom in Canada. And we do that primarily through litigation. That's maybe roughly 2/3 of our budget, but the other third is communication. So we get our guest columns published in the Globe and Mail, the National Post, the Epoch Times, the Western Standard, other publications. We release studies and reports. We do a lot of media interviews. We do podcasts and video casts like what we're doing right now. And so we're continually trying to educate the Canadian public about freedom and about why we believe that the free society is better than an authoritarian regime. So that's our purpose. Do you want me to dive into the bills?
Yeah, please elaborate a little bit more on this bill, because I don't know that many people know the intricacies of it.
Yeah. Well, the ones before this Friday, the 13th, or Thursday, the 12th of March, in the next few days, the Parliament will vote on the Combating Hate Act, which, among other things, will remove the current protection for religious leaders that if a Catholic priest or a conservative evangelical pastor or an Orthodox Jewish rabbi or a Muslim imam, if they teach what their scriptures say about homosexuality, they're not going to be facing a hate speech prosecution. Bill C-9, the Combating Hate Act, seeks to get rid of that protection for religious speech. So that's going to go to a vote this week. Other bills before Parliament include the Strong Borders Act, which really should be called the Strong Surveillance Act, has provisions in there to allow Canada Post to open mail, to make it illegal to use cash in amounts more than $10,000, which of course is a limit that can be reduced down to smaller and smaller amounts. The worst threat, though, worse than any of the bills before Parliament, is the Online Harms Act, which died with the last election, but the government keeps on saying they're going to bring it back. That is legislation that would empower the federal cabinet to pass internet censorship regulations without any oversight from Parliament, to have those internet censorship regulations enforced by a Digital Safety Commission, and also to change the Human Rights Act and empower the Canadian Human Rights Commission to prosecute Canadians over discriminatory speech, not criminal hate speech, discriminatory speech, with punishments of up to $50,000 plus up to $20,000 payable to a complainant. So those are the provisions of the Online Harms Act brought out for the children. Oh, we got to protect the children from harm. Therefore, we got to take away your rights and freedoms. That's kind of how they operate.
Well, so what do you say to people say, well, yeah, I do want to protect my children. People shouldn't say stuff about people's choices, lifestyle choices, or relationship choices. What do you say to those people?
That I agree that children should be protected. And we have currently on the books, it is a criminal code offense to lure a child, to expose a child to pornography. It's criminal code offense to threaten somebody to release a naked picture. Revenge porn is illegal. Intimidation is criminal. Uttering threats is criminal. There's all these, I had them all summarized in a column that was printed a while back in the Epoch Times, but we have all these laws on the books that protect children from internet predators, from pedophiles, from online harms. So two things need to happen. Parents need to be far more diligent and attentive than what they are generally, and not give their kids this unsupervised, unrestricted, go onto the internet whenever you want type of a thing. So parents have to step up to the plate and do a better job. But we don't need a bunch of, and secondly, we might need better law enforcement. I don't know. Maybe the police are underfunded in not being able to go after the bad guys. I don't know. But we don't need a bunch of new laws that give the federal cabinet power to pass regulations that censor what we're allowed to say and see on the internet. That's such a far stretch, is totally removed from children who can be protected by existing laws.
So there are sufficient protections already on the books, and we don't need this.
In one sentence, yes.
Yeah. So we don't need.
You're much more concise than I am.
So what is the motivation of these politicians to introduce this additional bill if there's already these protections in the criminal code?
I think some people look. I'm skating on thin ice because I don't pretend to know what's in somebody else's mind or heart. The only thing you can observe from other people is their conduct, their behavior. So I don't pretend to know. But some people they're not fans of the free society. I mean, they will tell you, of course, do you support freedom? Oh, of course I support freedom. I mean, everybody says that, but they don't really understand that that the government shouldn't be involved in deciding what is true or false, hateful or not hateful. So there are people that are not friends of the free society. Anybody who is pushing forward a law that would give the federal cabinet ministers power to kick somebody off the internet. That's another bill before Parliament right now, the Cybersecurity Act, Bill C-8. If that passes, individual cabinet ministers can kick a Canadian off the internet, leave you entirely vulnerable. You can't do banking, you can't use your phone, you can't access the internet. People bringing forward that, they're not friends of freedom, as far as I can tell.
So, John, I can hear people out there thinking, yeah, you should be able to kick people off who are saying bad things on the internet. What do you say to those people?
Under existing laws, you can prosecute people. If somebody, in the Cybersecurity Act, it also extends the state's powers to regulate companies, to gather information. It builds up the surveillance state. It's not necessary because you can enforce, there's existing laws. You cannot hack your way into the Department of National Defense or another government department or a private company or your next door neighbor. That's already a crime. To cause harm, to cause damage to somebody else's property is criminal. To steal their lists and make those public and violate privacy, there are already laws on the books against that. But what we see with the Cybersecurity Act, Bill C-8, is this government power grab in the name of protecting our critical cybersecurity systems, when those systems are already, it's already punishable if you cause any harm to
John,
those systems.
You mentioned that our freedoms have been gradually eroding for 40 or 50 years. Now, that's an interesting timeline you brought up because the Canadian Constitution was introduced in 1982. So did that play a role? Or, I mean, the Constitution is supposed to be a good thing, right?
People will debate, and I think there's very strong arguments on both sides. People will debate whether the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or the Charter for short, which was added to our Constitution in 1982, whether that's been a good thing or a bad thing. You have arguments on both sides. What I believe is that law follows politics, politics follows culture, culture follows education. And we have seen a gradual dismantling of the teaching of history and the teaching of civics in school. And so you've got a generation, perhaps two generations or more, that have learned very little about history. They haven't learned about our rights and freedoms. They haven't learned about the free society. And so the sad thing is people who are ignorant of history can be convinced of anything. And there's a lot of historical illiteracy. People don't know, haven't learned how, Germany transitioned from a democracy that had elections and free speech and religious freedom, transitioned from that into the National Socialist dictatorship that took power in 1933. Mm-hmm. People haven't studied how that collapse of democracy took place. Yep. That's just one example. And so that's really the root problem, is that many Canadians are ignorant of the free society. Many Canadians don't share the conviction that I think the three of us have, that many, hopefully all of viewers and listeners have, that a free society is actually superior to a fascist or communist or national socialist or theocratic government.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and it's interesting that you walked right into the my next question, which was going to be, or comment, which was going to be that a lot of what is occurring right now, we hear in society the term Nazi thrown around very freely, generally in reference to the opposite political party, which is in power right now. And what's ironic about it is that the current administration, the policies that they're implementing, the gradual erosion of rights and freedoms that they are removing, is very similar to, as you just described, the rise of the National Socialists and and Nazi Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s, where they determined what was information and what was misinformation, where they had giant bonfires, or they burned books that were considered misinformation and not correct doctrine, and they persecuted people who did not espouse the virtues and the values that they shared as the highest values possible in Nazi Germany. So they completely ended the Weimar Republic before it, and then instituted the National Socialist regime that took over. And people think that it is the we'll call it literally here the conservatives and the right wing politicians in Canada and the United States who are in favor of those policies, and yet it is actually the political left that is implementing a lot of those policies here. And I think people are very naive to that. And so I'm glad that you guys are voicing that or raising that awareness, because right now it's starting to read very similar to the book Animal Farm. If anybody has ever read the book Animal Farm, and I think that should be required reading for anyone, in addition to the book 1984, those are very well. It's true. The information the plot that occurs in those books is eerily similar to what is occurring in reality today, and it's very scary to see the slope that you're headed on. And so the direction I'm going to take us here is, you talked a lot about history, and you talked about people not understanding history, or having a very superficial or perhaps limited awareness of Canadian history. And I think that is no clearer than what is going on, as you brought up at the beginning, with the land right issue in BC. And I think that all begins with the land acknowledgements that have been instituted into society over the last 10 years. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe dive a little bit deeper into that subject, and how our history is potentially being rewritten to suit the narrative of today's leadership and to achieve a certain objective.
Well, I'm sure most people have heard about the new Musqueam Agreement, which the federal government signed in secret, and was signed on February the 20th, 2026, and was only became public as a done deal. Members of the public were not consulted. This rights recognition agreement, as it's called, is recognizes Musqueam, who are one of actually 4 Aboriginal groups claiming ownership of Vancouver, British Columbia. So we've got the Musqueam, the Tsawwassen, the Squamish, and the Cowichan are claiming that they own Vancouver, Burnaby, Richmond, New Westminster, so on and so forth, all of or parts of this. So the federal government signed an agreement with the Musqueam, saying the Musqueam have Aboriginal title over this huge tract of land that includes Greater Vancouver, the Northwest Van, parts of Delta, parts of Surrey and Coquitlam. And this is negotiated in secret and presented to taxpayers as a done deal after the fact. Now, the Musqueam chief was very quick to rush out and say, don't worry, we're not going after anybody's private property. We're not going to charge rent. And the federal government saying, oh, this is just, it's a gesture of goodwill.
It's supposed to be symbolic.
It's symbolic.
So then why do you care so much?
So why does it have to be documented?
Well, I've got, the agreement itself says, and you know this, and your audience, a lease or a business contract. I mean, what it says matters. If I'm your landlord and I sign a lease, commercial, residential, whatever, and if the lease says that you have to pay me $5,000 a month, I could temporarily say, hey, don't worry about rent for March, don't worry about rent for April. But there's an agreement there that says that the tenant's going to pay me $5,000 a month.
So you're saying at some point in the future, they could come back, the Musqueam can come back and say, there should be a 1% fee for every BC resident to pay us for damages of stealing our land, or no, you've told us we actually still own this land, and so you're going to pay us a 1% annual fee. They can do that.
My interpretation of this agreement uses express language of Aboriginal title, and the Supreme Court of Canada in numerous court cases has said Aboriginal title means ownership of the land. It's not just a right to do some hunting and fishing. It's not, an interest in property. It's actual ownership of the land. So they talk about Aboriginal title. They talk about government to government relations between the Musqueam and Canada as if they're two countries. They talk about setting up a third order of Aboriginal government that's going to coexist alongside federal and provincial to have a say over how Vancouver is run, which I don't think we need another. We've got federal and provincial. We've got municipal governments as well, which actually fall under the authority of the province. We already have 3 levels, right? And now this is going to have, a 4th level of government where the Musqueam, who number 1,500 people, that's the Musqueam today. It's 1,500 people. Yeah. And these 1,500 people are going to have a say about everything, about roads and bridges and waterways and how the place is run.
Why are we affording them a disproportionate influence on the outcomes of?
Okay, let's step back a bit.
Because the land acknowledgements are indoctrinating the whole population into a false guilt about, we live on stolen land, which is not true. When the Europeans showed up here, it was not a $2.5 trillion per year economy. The economy has been built up over centuries by Canadians of all kinds of ethnicities, including Aboriginal Canadians have also played a role in the building up of the economy in the last 200 years. So when the Europeans showed up, it wasn't like it came and took this economy that's $2.5 trillion per year. I think that's the number for 2025.
How does this situation compare to on an international scale? So in New Zealand and Australia, the U.S., where there are Aboriginal people, or South America, is this type of arrangement normal? What we just did with this group, or is this completely unique to Canada?
It is. Look, we've got this United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and this was, I think, 2012. I'm not sure of the year, but it's been around for a decade or more, I think. And Canada has passed legislation federally saying that the federal government recognizes and seeks to implement the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The problem with the declaration, in my view, is that it creates racial or ethnic divisions between people. And it says that different people have different legal rights depending on their ancestry. And it's a repudiation of a principle of equal rights for all, special privileges for none, which I think is the only viable principle that can produce social cohesion, social harmony in a country that has more than one ethnic group, of which Canada, most certainly, we've got our, Chinese, East Indian, African, European, Aboriginal, we've got everything here.
So we don't really know what's been going on in Australia and New Zealand with even though the United Nations has made these declarations, and we all know the UN has made all sorts of declarations that nobody pays attention to. Has any other country taken action?
It's an international problem. Yeah. Like in Australia, they had a referendum to give race-based or ethnic-based rights to Aborigines in Australia. That was defeated, and I think it was good because there were enough people in Australia, including Aboriginal people, who said, we're better off with the principle of equal rights for all, special privileges for none, no race-based laws. New Zealand, I've not been following closely, but it's quite different there. You've got the Maori, and they've got the Maori have their own seats in parliament, and there's this whole race-based stuff, which just creates strife and resentment and conflict. It's not the way to reconciliation.
So if this principle were to be applied in Europe, where land has changed ownership in hands ad nauseum over the course of 3 millennia, ancient Greece used to dominate all of the Mediterranean. Southern Italy belonged to ancient Greece, and present-day Turkey was ancient Greece. Persia was eventually conquered. Northern India, So, should the Greeks be getting a special acknowledgement and a financial fee for having their land taken from them through wars? Or, I mean, this concept just befuddles me.
I as soon as you started, I was about to say, because I visited Greece and I hope to visit Turkey someday, but I know there's parts of modern day Turkey that were Greek and Christian, and now they're Turkish and Muslim.
My grandparents were from Constantinople, which is present day Istanbul. That used to be Greek territory. So I'm just wondering: is the Turkish government acknowledging that they took Constantinople from the Greeks, and are they giving them special privileges, or is this a uniquely Canadian process of self-immolation?
It's Canada, and New Zealand, and there are some countries in Latin America that are, looking at how to implement this United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And, the intentions might be good, but I think here's the problem as I see it. Let's assume for argument's sake that injustices were perpetrated when the Europeans and Asians and Africans moved into the Americas. Okay. And I think it's debatable, but or at least the extent of it is debatable. But if we assume for argument's sake that injustices were perpetrated by Europeans, Asians, and Africans moving to the Americas, okay, you cannot correct that problem without inflicting injustice on other people today. That's the practical issue. And the Greek-Turkey example, for example, to apply that there, okay, you would have to perpetrate an injustice on current Turkish homeowners if you wanted to give that land back to Greece because it was wrongfully taken 50 years ago or 200 years ago or 500 years ago. You have to inflict injustice on modern day homeowners who have bought their house or their little piece of land in good faith. They're living there, they're earning a living. And then to come along and say, well, you don't really own this because it's actually owned by the Greeks. That's unfair to the current day homeowners. And that's the problem with the Musqueam Agreement is it says that the Musqueam have Aboriginal title over Vancouver. You got 2 million people in BC in that area. Okay, 5 million for the whole province, but you've got more than 2 million people whose home ownership is now in question.
Yeah.
Is this happening in Southern Ontario?
Not yet, but with the same federal government, it would not surprise me in the least if right now the federal government's negotiating similar deals, treaties, agreements, whatever, with Aboriginal groups all over Canada. And we've seen from what's happened with the Musqueam that there's no public input, there's no consultation, homeowners don't get to decide. This is presented as a done deal after the fact, which is profoundly anti-democratic.
Yes, it is. And radically irresponsible because, as you mentioned, it punishes people who had little or nothing to do with the actions that occurred. We're talking 500 years ago. If we're going back to the first arrival of Europeans into North America. And so punishing the current generation achieves nothing other than inflicting, as you said, injustice for injustice sake. So all you're doing is trading injustices back and forth, with different groups who were not responsible for the original injustice, if there is one. And unfortunately, we don't have time to delve too far into whether or not there was one. As much as I would like to, because I know that we're up against the clock here. But I wanted to ask you, John, before we ran out of time, what is the long-term ramification of this? How can we expect to see this unfold on its current trajectory, and how will it impact things like the real estate market here in Canada?
Disastrous impact on real estate. If this agreement is not torn up, rescinded, and shredded, it's a bad situation for real estate, or alternatively, it's a bad situation for taxpayers. When the Supreme Court of British Columbia ruled in August, or it could have been July or June, but roughly 6 months ago, we had this Cowichan ruling whereby the Supreme Court of British Columbia said that the Cowichan Aboriginals have Aboriginal title over a section of Richmond, it was a suburb south of Vancouver. And so the BC Premier at one point stepped in and announced, I don't know if he's followed through on this or not, but there's going to be this multi-billion-dollar bailout where the government of British Columbia would pay the Cowichan or pay the homeowners or whatever and try to get this back on track, because people, I've heard anecdotally, and I haven't been able to verify this, that their mortgages can't be renewed. Their property values have sunk down. Nobody wants to buy. I mean, would you buy a house in Richmond right now?
Absolutely not.
If you were planning to move to BC, or would you maybe go somewhere else? So it's disastrous for that certainty that a strong economy requires. So what can be done, though, this Musqueam Agreement, rights recognition agreement, this is not required. It's not a requirement of Canada's Constitution. The government should tear it up, which they shouldn't have a problem doing. They say that the terms don't really matter anyway. It's just a nice expression of
yeah.
It's don't worry about the wording. Well, if that's true, then you should feel quite comfortable tearing it up. They need to tear this up, and people need to contact their federal MP. I don't care if she or he is Liberal, Conservative, NDP, Bloc, Green. Contact your MP and say, we don't want race-based agreements like this, and we want secure title. We want secure property rights everywhere in Canada, no exceptions. When MPs get that message, that's got to be the way forward and the solution, because if people don't contact their MPs about this, the MPs are going to think, okay, well, Canadians are fine, and so we'll do more of these agreements.
Yeah. If you don't already have one, John, might I suggest the creation of a forum letter that people could share with their MPs, because I think this is a great initiative, something that needs to be undertaken by a large majority of people. I know some people will feel as though it's an inconvenience or a hassle to have to do it, but I think it's an important task that everybody does, and so we should probably remove as many barriers to doing so as possible. And one last comment that I wanted to make on that is, aside from the real estate market, I think it would be disastrous for the financial market as well, because think about how the banks, we'd like to think of our banking institution here as, fairly intransigent and safe and secure. Imagine for a second that the real estate prices and the real estate values in the country collapsed, and the banks, who have billions upon billions of dollars in mortgages outstanding and essentially partial ownership in that real estate, all of a sudden disappear. That could have a catastrophic impact on the financial system and on our economy as a whole. And so I think this is an issue which is like an iceberg. There's a lot more beneath the surface, and it has the potential to have some dire consequences for a country and our economy as a whole that people don't realize. But anyway, I know we're out of time, so I want to just ask you really quickly, where can people get more information about your organization and learn more about the situation that's occurring in BC?
So the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, JCCF, our website is www.jccf.ca. So Justice Center Constitutional Freedoms, jccf.ca. People are welcome to sign up for our email newsletter. We send that out only once or twice a month, not every day. And we're supported entirely by voluntary donations. Last month, we sent out just under 10,000 tax receipts for amounts, anywhere from $100 to $1,000 to $100,000, everything in between. So people are welcome to donate, to get an official tax receipt, or just sign up for the newsletter. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have been able to join you and your viewers and listeners today.
Thank you, John. We really appreciate you coming on. And if you'd be willing to, we'd love to have you on to talk again, because I know we're just scratching the surface on this, and there's a lot more I'd love to discuss with you.
Yeah,
so
we didn't even discuss Southern Italy, and Naples was founded by the Greeks too. Yeah.
Stop it! You have enough time to yammer on to people's ears about what happened to Greece. So we don't need to waste our listeners' time with it. I get to hear enough of it as it is. So anyway, thank you, John. And if you're willing, we'd love to have you on again in the future.
Be happy to come back. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you.
All right. And with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Prescribing Prosperity podcast. Anybody who's interested in contacting us can reach out at info@medwealth.ca, or visit our website, which is med-wealth.ca. And we look forward to hearing from all of our listeners and hearing their thoughts about the episode, and potentially anybody who wants to get in touch with us about our services. And so with that, we're going to wrap it up. And I guess we're not turning it over to Bill. We're just going to say so long for today, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Prescribing Prosperity. Visit our website at med-wealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca for more information or to connect with us for a consultation. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the hosts and their guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of IPC Securities Corporation. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investment advice. Always seek the advice of a qualified and licensed financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment or retirement planning. MedWealth Financial Services can provide a private consultation to help you determine the suitability of any guidance discussed on the show.